Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. There are certain things in life you should never open. Some doors, some books, some memories. And in my case, a music box. I never considered myself a superstitious person. In fact, if you'd told me a few months ago that an object, something as seemingly innocent as a music box, could destroy lives, I would have laughed. But now, as I sit here in the flickering light of my apartment, listening to the faint hum of that cursed melody echoing from the other room, I realize how wrong I was. The music box came into my possession almost by accident, or perhaps it wasn't. Looking back, it feels like fate, dark, twisted fate, pushed it into my hands. It all started at an estate sale. I was there, not for anything specific, just browsing. My girlfriend, Emma, loved antique shopping, so I often tagged along. She would marvel at old furniture and dusty trinkets, while I lazily wandered around, pretending to care. But that day was different. The moment I stepped into the dimly lit house, I felt something, like I didn't belong, like I was trespassing. The house was old, the kind of place that holds on to the past in a way that makes the air feel thick. The scent of mildew clung to the walls, and every floorboard creaked underfoot. It felt abandoned, despite the few people moving from room to room, picking through old belongings. And then I saw it, sitting on a shelf, half hidden behind a pile of dusty books. A small, intricately carved music box. Its wood was dark, almost black, and its surface was covered with strange symbols I didn't recognize. It looked ancient, out of place among the other things. Something about it drew me in, like it wanted to be found. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hand. The wood was cold, unnaturally so. Without thinking, I turned the small, delicate key on the side. That's when I heard it. The melody was haunting, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. It wasn't the cheerful, whimsical tune you'd expect from a music box. No, this was slow, dissonant, and unsettling. It reminded me of a song you'd hear in a forgotten, abandoned carnival at night. I snapped the box shut, and the music stopped abruptly. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. "You should take it." I nearly jumped out of my skin. An old man had appeared beside me, as if from nowhere. His face was wrinkled, his eyes cloudy with age, but there was something sharp about the way he looked at me, like he knew more than he let on. No, I was just looking," I stammered, trying to hand the box back. But he shook his head. "Take it," he repeated, his voice low and insistent. "It's yours now." Against my better judgment, I did. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or the eerie pull the box had on me. Either way, I left the house with the music box in my possession, not realizing the horror that would follow. It started small. The first night after Emma had gone to bed, I decided to open the box again. I don't know why. Something about it gnawed at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. As soon as I turned the key, that same chilling melody filled the room. But this time, there was something different. Something wrong. The air around me grew cold, and I felt a strange pressure, like someone, or something, was watching me. I snapped the box shut, my hands trembling. But the melody didn't stop. It continued, soft and distant, even though the box was closed. I set it down on the table, stepping back, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But the tune grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the room. That's when I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was Emma calling me from the bedroom, but the voice was too low, too raspy. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. There, in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it, A shadow, darker than the rest, moving, shifting. I froze. The shadow seemed to stretch, growing taller until it almost reached the ceiling. It didn't have a face, just a vague humanoid shape. But I could feel it watching me. And then, it spoke again. Soft, almost a hiss. Let me out. I backed away, my chest tight with fear. The box was still playing its haunting tune, louder now, more frantic, as if the melody itself was alive. I grabbed it, trying to shut it off, but no matter what I did, the music wouldn't stop. Emma found me standing there, clutching the box, pale and shaking. I tried to explain, but she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "It's just a music box," she said, trying to calm me down. "You're probably just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. Over the next few days, things got worse. The music would play at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, other times while I was at work. No matter where I put the box, I would hear the melody. And each time it played, that shadow would appear, closer and more defined. It began to invade my dreams, too. I would see myself standing in an endless void, with the music box in my hands. And every time I opened it, the shadow would emerge, creeping toward me, whispering those same words. "Let me out." I became obsessed with the box, trying to find a way to stop it. I scoured the internet searching for any information on cursed objects, haunted music boxes, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No explanation, no solution. I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Emma grew distant, worried about my erratic behavior. She couldn't hear the music, couldn't see the shadow. To her, I was losing my mind. And maybe I was. One night, after another argument, I decided to get rid of the box. I drove out to the lake, far from town, and hurled it into the water. I watched it sink beneath the surface, relieved to finally be free of its curse. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same haunting melody, playing softly from somewhere in the distance. And when I turned toward the corner of the room, I saw the shadow, standing there, waiting. "Let me out," it whispered. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Days, weeks, they all blur together. The music box came back. I found it sitting on my nightstand the next morning, as if it had never left. The shadow, too, has grown stronger. It no longer waits in the corners of the room. It stands at the foot of my bed, watching, whispering. Emma left a few days ago. She couldn't handle it anymore. Couldn't handle me. I don't blame her. She didn't understand. Couldn't see what I was dealing with. But now, as I sit here, alone in this apartment, I know what I have to do. The shadow has been getting closer. Every time the music plays, it inches nearer, its form more defined, more solid. I can feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. And the whispers, they've changed. Open the box. It wants me to open it, to release whatever is trapped inside. I've resisted for as long as I can, but I know I won't be able to hold out much longer. The pull is too strong. I'm not sure what will happen when I do. Maybe it will finally stop. Maybe it will end this nightmare. Or maybe, just maybe, I'll become a part of it. The box sits in front of me now, its intricate carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. The key is in my hand, cold and heavy. I don't want to do this, but I have no choice. I place the key in the lock and begin to turn. They say every small town has its ghost story. Ours was no different. Growing up in the quiet, sleepy town of Larkspur, I'd heard the tales about the woman in the black veil since I was a child. It was a story parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far after dark. But no one ever really believed in it, not really. At least I didn't, until I saw her myself. My name is Daniel, and at the time this all happened, I was 28 years old, living in the same town where I was born and raised. Larkspur is a place where not much changes. People grow up, settle down, have kids, and never leave. Maybe that's why the ghost stories stick around. There's not much else to talk about. The legend of the woman in the black veil was simple enough. She was said to be the restless spirit of a widow, roaming the streets at night in search of something, someone. According to the story, she had died tragically over a century ago, after her husband vanished on the eve of their wedding. Stricken with grief, she threw herself into the river and drowned. Since then, she'd been seen wandering the town, dressed in a long black dress, her face hidden beneath a thick veil, appearing only to those who were lost either in life or spirit. I had never given the story much thought. Ghosts were just that, stories. But that all changed the night I moved into the old house on the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for years. It sat at the end of a long, narrow road, surrounded by tall trees and overgrown grass. The paint had long since faded, and the windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes. Most people in town avoided it, claiming it was haunted, but I didn't care. I was looking for a cheap place to rent, and the price was unbeatable. Emma, my girlfriend, wasn't thrilled about the idea of moving into what she called the creepy old house, but we needed somewhere to live, and I assured her it was just temporary. Besides, the house had a certain charm, despite its dilapidated state. It felt like a fresh start, even if it was a little rough around the edges. Our first night there was uneventful. We unpacked, ordered pizza, and settled in. Emma joked about the house being haunted, but I brushed it off. It was just an old house, nothing more. But as the days passed, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. Doors would creak open on their own, despite being locked. Cold drafts would sweep through the rooms, even though the windows were tightly shut. At first, I blamed it on the age of the house. Old houses had a way of making strange noises, didn't they? But soon, the occurrences became harder to explain. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard a sound coming from downstairs. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. I dismissed it as the wind, but Emma wasn't convinced. "Daniel, that's not the wind," she said, her voice trembling. "It's too deliberate." I listened again, and she was right. The tapping had a pattern to it, almost like footsteps, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the house. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. The house was silent now, but the feeling that something was wrong lingered. I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day, I decided to ask around town about the house. Most people were reluctant to talk about it, shaking their heads or muttering under their breath. But one old man, Mr. Hargrove, a lifelong resident of Larkspur, was more than willing to share. "That house," he said, leaning forward in his chair at the local diner, "used to belong to the Harrington family, back in the late 1800s. Tragic story, really." "What happened?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "Their daughter Isabella was set to be married, but her fiancé disappeared just days before the wedding. She was heartbroken, devastated. No one knows what happened to him, but she never got over it. People say she wandered the streets in her wedding dress looking for him. And then one night, she just vanished." "Vanished?" "They found her body in the river a few days later. Some say she drowned herself, but others, well, they say she was looking for something, or someone, to take with her." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in. "And the house?" "Abandoned ever since. People claim they see her sometimes, wandering near the house or along the river dressed in black. They call her the woman in the black veil." I left the diner with a heavy heart, the story playing over and over in my mind. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I couldn't deny that something was wrong with the house. And now, knowing its history, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living in the middle of a nightmare. That night, the tapping returned. It started softly, almost like a whisper, but gradually grew louder, more insistent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. Emma was asleep beside me, oblivious to the sound, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and made my way downstairs again. The house was cold, unnaturally so, and the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. The tapping was louder now, echoing through the walls, leading me to the front door. When I opened it, I saw her. She was standing at the end of the driveway, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Her figure was tall and slender, draped in a long black gown. Her face was hidden beneath a thick, black veil that fluttered slightly in the breeze. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that the figure wasn't real. But then she moved, slow, deliberate steps toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air around me grew colder with every step she took, and the tapping sound seemed to follow her, as if it was coming from her very footsteps. Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond. She just kept walking, her movements slow and unnatural, like she was gliding across the ground. As she reached the base of the porch, I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. For hours I sat by the door, clutching the flashlight like it was my only lifeline. I didn't hear the tapping again that night, but the memory of her figure, silent, haunting, stayed with me. The days that followed were a blur. Emma noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had seen. She wouldn't believe me. I barely believed it myself. But the tapping continued, always at night, always the same rhythmic pattern. And each time I opened the door, she was there, standing just out of reach, waiting. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what she wanted, why she was haunting me. So when I heard the tapping again, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and flung the door open. This time, she was closer. She stood at the foot of the porch steps, her veil obscuring her face, her black gown flowing like liquid darkness around her. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to step forward. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. For a long moment, she said nothing. But then, slowly, she lifted her hand. Her fingers were pale, almost translucent, and she pointed toward the house, toward the upstairs window where Emma slept. I felt a cold rush of fear sweep over me. "No," I whispered. "You can't have her." The woman didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew what she wanted. She had been searching for her lost love for over a century, and now she was trying to take Emma, to replace what she had lost. "No," I repeated, louder this time. "You can't have her." I backed away, slamming the door shut. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, like she was pounding on the walls, trying to break through. I ran upstairs to the bedroom where Emma was still fast asleep, unaware of the terror that lurked outside. I sat beside her, my heart racing, trying to think of what to do. But before I could come up with a plan, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and oppressive. And then I heard her voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "I'll be back," she whispered, her words sending a chill down my spine. I never saw her again after that night, but the memory of her still haunts me. The house on the edge of town remains empty now, abandoned once more. Emma and I moved away, far from Larkspur, far from the woman in the black veil. But sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the house creaks, I think I hear it. The soft, rhythmic tapping of her footsteps, still searching for what she lost. I never believed in curses. I've always been a rational man, firmly planted in reality. But what happened to me, to my family, defies any explanation. I can't keep this story to myself anymore. If you've stumbled across it, you may think I'm delusional. I wouldn't blame you, but I need to tell someone. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's just a burden I need to unload. Either way, you'll see why I don't keep any family heirlooms in my house anymore. My name is Ben Mercer. I'm 35 years old, and I live just outside of Boston. The events I'm about to describe began 2 years ago, on the day my grandmother died. I wasn't particularly close to my grandmother, Evelyn Mercer at least, not as close as my mother had been. Grandma was cold, distant. I could never figure out if it was just her personality or something deeper, but I learned from an early age that Evelyn kept secrets. Secrets no one in the family dared ask about. When she passed, my mother was devastated. Evelyn had been her rock after my grandfather died, and in the days leading up to the funeral, my mom started sorting through all the things Grandma had left behind. That's when I first saw Maet, the box. A heavy, ornate chest made of dark wood, with strange, intricate carvings across its surface. The box seemed old, older than anything else in Evelyn's house. "What's that?" I asked when I noticed my mom lingering over it, her hands trembling. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the box like she had seen a ghost. "It's best we don't open it," she muttered, more to herself than to me. Her voice was laced with fear, the kind of fear you feel when you know something terrible is about to happen. "We should just leave it be." Naturally, her words sparked my curiosity. I'm not superstitious, so I didn't think much of it. The box couldn't be dangerous. It was just an object. What harm could it do? That night, when everyone else was asleep, I made up my mind to open it. I waited until the house was quiet and crept downstairs. There, in the dim glow of the living room lamp, the box sat on the table like an unwanted guest. My hands were steady as I lifted the lid, but the moment the lock clicked open, a wave of icy dread washed over me. Inside were a few old, dusty objects. A tarnished silver locket, an antique mirror with cracks running through its surface, and a photograph in a cracked frame. The photograph caught my attention. It was a black and white picture of a family, 4 people. My great-grandfather, a young Evelyn, a boy I didn't recognize, and a woman I had never seen before. Something about the woman's face made me uncomfortable. Her eyes seemed hollow, almost lifeless, as though they were staring straight into my soul. I put the photograph down quickly and picked up the locket. It felt unnaturally cold in my hand. A whisper, barely audible, slipped into my ears, like a voice from another room. I froze, holding my breath. There was no one around, but I could swear I heard it. "I'm still here." The voice was faint, almost a sigh, but it was enough to send a chill up my spine. I dropped the locket, the metal clattering on the table. My heart pounded against my ribs as I slammed the box shut and shoved it back under the table. That's when the knocking started. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. It was past midnight. No one should have been out there. My skin prickled with unease as I approached the door, hesitating before opening it. I half expected to find some stranger, maybe a lost traveler or an insomniac neighbor. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The street was empty. The silence was suffocating. I closed the door, my pulse racing, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was just kids messing around. But when I turned around, the locket was lying on the floor in the middle of the hallway. I didn't drop it there. I know I didn't. That night, I barely slept. The knocking returned at random intervals, always 3 knocks, always at the front door. And every time I checked, there was no one there. It didn't stop until dawn. The following days were worse. Objects in the house started moving on their own. The locket reappeared in places I hadn't touched it. On my nightstand, the bathroom sink, even on the passenger seat of my car. The photograph, too, seemed to change. The woman in the picture, the one with the hollow eyes, looked different. Her expression grew darker, angrier, as though she was watching me, waiting. It wasn't until I asked my mom about the box that I started to understand what was happening. "That box," she began, her voice shaking. "It's been in the family for generations. It's cursed, Ben. My grandmother told me about it when I was a little girl. Every item in there belonged to someone in the family, someone who met a tragic end." She told me about the boy in the photograph. His name was Samuel, my great-uncle. He had drowned when he was just 10 years old. His body was never found, but the mirror had belonged to him. As for the woman, that was my great-grandmother. No one spoke of her because she had taken her own life shortly after Samuel's death. "But the curse," my mom whispered, "it doesn't end with them." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like it was taunting me. I knew I had made a mistake by opening the box, but it was too late to undo it. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. The knocks at the door were now accompanied by whispering, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls. Objects would shatter for no reason. Lights would flicker and go out, plunging me into darkness without warning. And every time I looked at the photograph, the woman's eyes followed me, her gaze growing more menacing with each passing day. Then came the night I'll never forget. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my bedroom. They were slow, deliberate. I turned over in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the woman from the photograph. Her face was pale, her eyes dark voids. She said nothing, just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, she raised her hand and pointed at the locket on my nightstand. "I'm still here," she whispered, the same voice I had heard before. In a blind panic, I grabbed the locket and threw it across the room. But when I looked back, she was gone. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the room itself was suffocating me. I knew I had to get rid of the box, but I didn't know how. The next day, I drove the box out to the woods, far from the house. I buried it deep, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Even now, I hear the knocking sometimes. Always 3 knocks, always at my front door. The woman's eyes still haunt my dreams, and every so often I'll find the locket lying somewhere I didn't put it. On the kitchen counter, in the glove compartment of my car. The curse didn't leave with the box. It's tied to me now, to my family. I don't know how to stop it. I'm still waiting for the next knock. They say if you listen hard enough at night, you'll hear voices in the woods behind our town. No one knows exactly where they come from or who they belong to, but the stories about them have haunted this place for generations. As a kid, I used to hear the rumors. My friends would dare each other to go to the edge of the forest and stay out there after dark. Most would make it no further than a few feet into the tree line before fear got the better of them. But me? I never thought much of it. Woods are just woods, right? At least that's what I used to believe. I'm Caleb Green, 28 years old, and I've lived in this small town in upstate New York all my life. Growing up here, you get used to strange things. Small towns tend to have their fair share of weirdness. But none of it ever really touched me. I thought I was immune to the eerie stories of haunted woods and ghostly whispers. Until the night I actually heard them myself. It started 2 years ago, not long after I moved back into town. My parents had both passed away by then, and I'd inherited their old house, a small, weathered thing sitting at the very edge of the woods. It was the house I grew up in, the house I swore I'd never come back to after I left for college. But life doesn't always go as planned. I needed a place to stay after a bad breakup, so back to the old house I went. At first, everything was normal. I settled in, redecorated, and tried to make it feel like home again. The woods were just there, silent, still, and almost comforting in their familiarity. But as the days turned into weeks, things began to change. The first time I noticed it was on a Tuesday night, just as I was getting ready for bed. The sun had set, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost like someone was calling out from far away. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or someone passing by, but the voice sounded off. It wasn't speaking words exactly, more like a whisper, carried by the wind. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. The next few nights were peaceful. No strange voices, no unsettling feelings. But by the end of the week, the whispers came back. This time, they were louder. It was around midnight, and I was sitting in the living room with the TV on low when I heard the voice again. But now it wasn't just one voice. It was several. Faint, overlapping murmurs coming from the woods. My body went cold. I muted the TV and listened. The voices seemed to drift in and out, almost as if they were moving through the trees just beyond my yard. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the pitch-black forest. Nothing moved. But the voices were still there, just loud enough to make out their eerie cadence, but not distinct enough to understand any words. I was unnerved, but not enough to do anything about it. I figured it was the wind, or maybe some distant neighbors playing music or talking. But then it happened again, and again. Night after night, the voices would come. Always from the woods, always just out of reach, and every time they seemed to get louder. One night I decided to try something different. I went outside. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and the air was chilly. I stepped out onto the porch, staring into the darkness that surrounded my house. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, but I could still hear the whispers. They were closer now, clearer. I could almost make out individual voices, but none of it made any sense. It was as if they were speaking a language I didn't understand. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the edge of the woods. As soon as I stepped off the porch, the voices stopped. Dead silence. The sudden quiet made my skin crawl. I stood there, just inside the tree line, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the forest was still, the air thick with tension. After a few minutes, I gave up and went back inside. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I told my friend Jake about the voices. We'd known each other since we were kids, and he was the type to believe in all the local legends about ghosts and curses. I figured he'd get a kick out of my story, but when I told him, his face went pale. "You heard the voices?" he asked, his tone deadly serious. I laughed it off. "Yeah, but it's probably just the wind or something." "No, Caleb," he said, shaking his head. "It's not the wind. My grandpa used to talk about those voices. Said they've been around for as long as the town's been here. People say the woods are haunted." "Haunted by what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake leaned in closer. "Spirits. They say if you listen to the voices long enough, they start calling your name. And if you follow them, you don't come back." I rolled my eyes. "That's just a story, man." Jake didn't smile. "Maybe. But you should be careful. Don't go out there at night anymore." I shrugged it off, but his words stuck with me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Jake had said, about the voices calling my name. It was stupid. I knew it. But when midnight rolled around, I found myself standing at the window again, staring out at the woods. The voices were there, louder than ever. This time they sounded urgent, like they were trying to tell me something. And then, clear as day, I heard it. "Caleb." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my mouth dry. It wasn't just a random murmur or whisper, it was my name. The voices had finally said my name. Panic gripped me, and I stepped back from the window. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The voices were real, and they were getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them, calling my name, urging me to come closer. I stayed in bed, covers pulled up to my chin like a terrified child. I told myself that as long as I didn't go into the woods, I'd be safe. But the next night, they were back. Louder, clearer. And they didn't just call my name this time. They begged. "Caleb, come to us." The pull was almost physical. I found myself drawn to the window again, staring into the dark, shadowy forest. The voices were louder now, almost frantic. "Caleb, please, help us." My hand trembled as I gripped the windowsill. I didn't know what they wanted, but I felt a deep, unsettling need to find out. It was as if they were beckoning me, luring me into the depths of the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside before I could talk myself out of it. The cold air bit at my skin as I stepped off the porch and into the trees. The moment I crossed the threshold, the voices stopped again. But this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, thick with the weight of something unseen. I walked deeper into the woods, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Every step I took felt like a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself. The urge to find the source of the voices was too strong, and then I saw it. In a small clearing just ahead, there was something on the ground. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. As I got closer, I realized it was a pile of bones. Human bones. They were scattered across the forest floor as though something or someone had just left them there. Suddenly the voices returned. But they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. Agonized, desperate screams that echoed through the trees, surrounding me. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The world spun around me, the screams growing louder, more intense. I turned to run, but something grabbed my ankle, yanking me to the ground. I don't remember much after that. Just darkness, cold, suffocating darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the edge of the woods, covered in dirt and leaves. My head throbbed, and my body ached. But I was alive. I don't know how I got out, or what happened in that clearing. But one thing is certain. The voices weren't just in my head. They were real. And they're still out there, waiting for someone else to listen. I haven't gone near the woods since that night. I can still hear the whispers sometimes, especially on quiet, windless nights. They call my name, over and over, begging me to come back. But I won't. Not ever again. Because now I know the truth. The woods aren't haunted by spirits. They're haunted by something much worse. You never think much about a whisper until it's the only thing you hear in a room that should be silent. That's how it started, the whispering. Faint, indecipherable words that danced just outside the reach of understanding. I was never a superstitious man, never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort, but what happened in that house, it changed everything. It's been 2 years now since I left that place, but the memories are burned into my mind like a scar. It still haunts me. Every night I wake up in a cold sweat, expecting to hear it again, that whisper. Sometimes I do. I guess I should start from the beginning. I moved into that old Victorian house in rural Pennsylvania with high hopes and optimism. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but I'd always wanted to restore a historic home. The idea of pulling something from the past into the present had always fascinated me. Plus, it was dirt cheap, an unbelievable steal for what I thought was a gorgeous piece of history. I was 34 at the time, newly divorced, and looking for a fresh start. My name is Ethan, by the way, though by the end of this story, that might not matter much. The house sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow up the sunlight. It was picturesque, in a dark, foreboding kind of way. The realtor mentioned it had been on the market for years. People had looked at it, but no one ever bid. I should have asked more questions, but at the time, all I saw was potential. The first few days went smoothly. I unpacked, settled in, and started making a list of repairs that needed to be done. The house was old, creaky, and drafty, nothing unusual for its age. But then, little things started happening. At first, I chalked them up to me being forgetful, lights flickering, doors left open that I swore I had closed. I dismissed it all. That is, until the kitchen incident. It was a Tuesday night, and I had just finished dinner. I left the dishes in the sink, too tired to deal with them right then. I headed to bed, figuring I'd handle them in the morning. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a crash so loud it shook the entire house. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, convinced someone had broken in. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to the bed and crept downstairs. The kitchen looked like a bomb had gone off. Plates shattered, cutlery scattered across the floor, cupboards wide open, the fridge door hanging ajar. My first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten inside, but the windows were intact and the doors were locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry. I stood there, baffled, the silence around me suffocating. And then, I heard it. The whispering. Faint, like a breath against my ear. Leave. I whipped around, bat raised, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, wrecked kitchen and the oppressive stillness of the house. I cleaned up the mess, trying to convince myself I had been half asleep and imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The whispering became a regular occurrence after that. At first, it was just at night when I was trying to sleep, but soon it followed me throughout the day. Always faint, just on the edge of hearing, but growing louder over time. And the house. God. The house started to change. It was subtle at first. The temperature would drop without warning, no matter how high I cranked the heat. Shadows would flicker in the corners of rooms, and sometimes I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turned. But the worst part was the feeling. The heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched, constantly. It was as though the house itself had eyes, and they never left me alone. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate steps that paused just outside the door, as if someone or something was waiting. I called out, "Who's there?" but received no response. The door remained closed, but the footsteps continued, circling the room from the outside. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in bed, gripping the bat, waiting for whatever it was to make its move. But it never did. It just watched, unseen, and I waited in the dark. The physical attacks began not long after. At first, it was minor, small cuts and bruises that I couldn't explain. Then it became worse. One morning, I woke to find deep, angry scratches down my back, as though something with claws had raked across my skin. The sheets were stained with blood, and yet there was no sign of any intruder. I thought I was losing my mind. I went to doctors, specialists. They all told me the same thing. Stress, anxiety, trauma from the divorce, they said. But I knew better. This wasn't in my head. Whatever was in that house, it wanted me gone. The final straw came one night when I returned from a trip to town. As I pulled up the driveway, I saw it, flames. The house was on fire. I ran inside, desperate to save what I could, but as I crossed the threshold, I realized something chilling. The fire wasn't natural. It wasn't burning the way fire should. Objects were floating in the air. Furniture, books, dishes, all spinning in a violent whirlwind, completely engulfed in flames that didn't spread beyond them. It was as though the fire was alive, feeding off the energy of the house itself. And then, I saw it. The source. In the center of the living room stood a figure. A shadow, darker than the night, featureless but unmistakably human in shape. It didn't move, didn't react as I stood frozen in place, watching as the house around me was torn apart. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices all telling me the same thing: leave. But I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the shadow. Suddenly the figure turned toward me, and though it had no face, I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. I ran. I didn't even think. I just turned and bolted out of the house into the woods, and I didn't stop running until I collapsed from exhaustion hours later. When I finally returned the next day, the house was a ruin. Charred, destroyed, everything was gone. I sold the land, what was left of it, and moved as far away as I could. But I still hear the whispering sometimes, especially at night. I've tried to move on, tried to rebuild my life, but that house, whatever was in it, has followed me. I see the shadow in my dreams. I hear the footsteps outside my bedroom door. And the whisper never stops. Leave. It started as a joke, a dare, really. You wouldn't last an hour in that forest, Chris said, pointing toward the edge of the woods that bordered our small town. We were sitting around a campfire at our usual spot, a clearing near the beginning of the thickest part of the forest. Everyone in town knew about that place, Blackwood Forest, they called it. An unsettling stretch of land that, according to local legend, had a way of getting into your head. No one really knew where the stories came from, but the forest had a reputation. It wasn't a place you ventured into willingly, not at night, not alone. I should have known better than to accept the dare. But when you're a 19-year-old with a bunch of friends who thrive on making you prove yourself, it's hard to back down. Especially with Maggie there, her eyes watching, half expecting me to chicken out. "You're on," I said, more confident than I felt. The rules were simple. I had to spend the night in Blackwood Forest. I could bring a flashlight and whatever else I needed, but I had to make it from dusk until dawn. If I managed to do it, the guys would pay for my gas for the next month. If I didn't, I'd never live it down. At least, that's how it started. Now, looking back, I wish I had just walked away. But there's no turning back the clock. The sky was already darkening as I made my way into the forest, the last sliver of the sun sinking below the horizon. The trees closed in around me almost immediately, their tall, twisted trunks creating an oppressive tunnel of shadows. My flashlight cut through the gloom, but the light felt weak, swallowed by the dense canopy overhead. It didn't take long for the silence to settle in. Blackwood Forest was known for that too, the eerie quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling through the leaves. Just the crunch of my boots on the dead foliage below and my own breathing, which sounded too loud in the stillness. I wasn't afraid, not yet at least. It was just a forest, after all. I had camped before, spent nights outdoors without any problems. This was supposed to be no different, but after walking for what felt like hours, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees all looked the same, dark, knotted, and ancient. My sense of direction was gone, as though the forest had twisted around me, erasing the path behind me. I stopped, looking around, shining my flashlight in every direction. Just trees, black trunks and gnarled branches reaching up like skeletal arms. "All right," I muttered to myself. "This is fine. Just fine." But then I heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl. Whispers. Faint, like they were carried on the wind, but there was no wind. I spun in place, trying to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was imagining it. After all, I knew the stories about Blackwood Forest. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, my pulse quickened and a knot of unease formed in my stomach. I kept walking. An hour later, the unease had grown into full-blown anxiety. I had been wandering aimlessly through the forest, and the whispers hadn't stopped. They weren't constant. Sometimes they'd fade, only to return louder and more insistent. And then there were the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the way the flashlight made the trees shift and move. but every so often I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Something that moved between the trees, just out of reach of the light. I told myself it was just animals. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew better. It wasn't an animal. There was something wrong with this place. Suddenly I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. I slowly turned around, shining my flashlight back the way I had come. For a moment there was nothing, just trees and darkness. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale, featureless, and utterly inhuman. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Not watching. Waiting. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my legs were burning and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, my mind racing. What the hell was that thing? I tried to calm myself, tried to think logically. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, my brain misinterpreting shadows. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew it wasn't true. There was something in this forest, something unnatural, and it was following me. The whispers returned, louder this time, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they were insistent, like they were trying to tell me something. Warn me, maybe. But it was too late for warnings. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, I realized something else, something far worse. The trees were moving. At first it was subtle, a slight shift in the branches, the way the trunks seemed to bend and sway, even though there was no wind. But then it became more obvious. The trees were closing in. I watched, horrified, as the forest seemed to twist and warp around me, the once distant trees now impossibly close. The path I had been on was gone, swallowed up by the shifting woods. I was trapped. My heart raced, panic setting in. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to the clearing, to my friends. But no matter which direction I turned, the trees seemed to block my path, closing in tighter and tighter. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all around me. They weren't speaking English, but I understood them all the same. Run. Escape. Leave. I tried. I ran again, stumbling over roots and rocks, the flashlight flickering in my shaking hand. But it was no use. The forest was alive, twisting and contorting, preventing any hope of escape. I don't know how long I wandered. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The whispers never stopped, always there, always pushing me deeper into the madness. At some point I must have fallen, because when I woke, I was lying on the forest floor, covered in dirt and leaves. My flashlight was gone, the darkness now complete. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. My mind was unraveling, fraying at the edges. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything except the whispers. They were louder now, more insistent, and then I heard the laughter. It started low, almost a chuckle, but it grew, becoming a high-pitched, maniacal cackle that echoed through the trees. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The laughter was in my head. I stumbled forward, blindly groping through the darkness, trying to find any way out. But there was no escape. The forest had me now, and it wasn't letting go. I don't know how long I wandered like that, lost in the dark, the laughter and whispers gnawing at my sanity. At some point, I found myself standing in a clearing, a different one from where I had started. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a cabin. It was old, decrepit, the wood rotting and the roof sagging, but it was real. It was something, a place of refuge. Maybe, just maybe, I could find shelter, figure out what was happening. I stumbled toward it, the door creaking open as I pushed it with trembling hands. Inside, the air was cold, damp, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. But it didn't matter. I was safe. Or so I thought. I don't know how long I stayed in that cabin. Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning by then. The whispers had followed me inside, the laughter never stopping, never ceasing. I had begun to lose track of who I was, my name, my life before the forest. It all seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. And then I saw it again. The figure. It stood in the doorway, its tall, lanky form casting a shadow over me. Its pale, featureless face tilted to one side, as though it were studying me, curious. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and then another. It was coming for me. And in that moment, as I stared into the void where its eyes should have been, I understood. This wasn't a forest. It wasn't even a place. It was a trap. A prison for the lost, the desperate, the foolish. A place that fed on fear, on madness. And now, it had me. Forever. The last thing I remember is the laughter, the sound of my own voice echoing through the trees as the darkness swallowed me whole. There's something deeply unsettling about empty playgrounds. In the light of day, they're innocent enough, brightly colored slides, swings swaying gently in the breeze, the echo of children's laughter in the air. But at night, under the pale glow of the moon, when the playground is deserted, it's different. The stillness is oppressive, as if the place remembers the laughter and longs for it to return. I never expected to feel that way about the playground at the end of my street, but after what happened that night, I'll never be able to look at it the same way again. I used to pass by it every day on my way to and from work. It was old, rusted in parts, the once bright paint peeling away. No one used it anymore, or at least I never saw anyone there. It was abandoned, just like much of the small town I'd moved into. A sleepy, forgotten place where the past felt more present than the future. But one night, something changed. It was late. I'd had a long shift at the diner where I worked, and I was walking home under a sky thick with clouds, the air heavy with an approaching storm. I was tired, my feet aching. But as I turned the corner and the playground came into view, I stopped dead in my tracks. The swings were moving. At first, I told myself it was the wind, though the air was eerily still. But then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle, the kind you'd expect from a child at play. It echoed softly through the empty park, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced around, squinting into the darkness, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the sound continued. Another giggle, then a faint, childish whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, distinct and unsettling. I should have kept walking. Every instinct told me to turn around and go home, forget what I heard. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I stood before the swing set, now creaking as both swings moved in perfect, eerie unison. There was no one there. No children, no families, just me. And yet, the sound of playtime continued, as if unseen children were running and laughing around me. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. I could feel it, a presence, something watching me from the shadows, though every time I turned, there was nothing. Suddenly the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, unnatural. I backed away, my pulse racing, but then something cold brushed against my hand. I jumped, nearly tripping over myself, and looked down. My heart stopped. A ball, an old, weathered rubber ball, was lying at my feet. I hadn't seen it before, but there it was, sitting perfectly still. The kind kids used to play with decades ago, before everything became plastic and electronic. Before I could react, a voice, soft but clear, drifted through the night. "Will you play with us?" I froze. My eyes darted around the empty playground. The voice was childlike but wrong. It had a hollow quality, like it was coming from far away or from something that didn't quite belong. I should go, I muttered, my voice barely audible. I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, the ball rolled. Slowly, deliberately, it moved across the gravel, stopping in front of the merry-go-round. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, small shapes flickering at the edge of my vision. But as I stared, the figures became clearer. Children. 4 of them, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing just beyond the merry-go-round. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and glassy. They looked like kids you'd see in a photograph from 100 years ago, timeless, and yet impossibly out of place. One of the girls stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Come play with us," she whispered again, her lips barely moving. The other children remained still, watching me with blank, empty eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But every sense screamed that it was. The cold, the darkness, the oppressive feeling of being watched. It was too real to be a dream. I opened my mouth to speak, to say anything, but no sound came out. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, backing away slowly. As I did, the children moved too, gliding toward me in eerie silence. Their feet didn't touch the ground, their expressions frozen in time, as if they were trapped in some endless, ghostly game of tag. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the street, not daring to look back. But I could hear them, the faint laughter, the whispering voices, growing fainter but still there, always just behind me. It wasn't until I reached the safety of my front door that the sound stopped completely. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing against the wall. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no logical explanation. Ghost children? Haunted playgrounds? It was absurd. And yet, I had seen them. I had heard them. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those empty, lifeless eyes staring at me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to return. For days, I avoided the playground. I took a different route to work, making sure to stay as far away from it as possible. But the nightmares continued. Every night, I dreamed of the children, of the rusted swings and the creaking merry-go-round. And every night, the whispers grew louder. Then, one evening, I made a terrible mistake. It had been almost a week since that night, and I was beginning to convince myself that maybe it had all been in my head. A trick of the mind, brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination. So, on my way home from work, I took the old route, the one that passed by the playground. As I rounded the corner, my heart sank. The ball was back. It was lying in the exact same spot, just like before. And next to it, standing in the dim light of the street lamp, were the children. All 4 of them staring at me with those same empty eyes. I should have run. I should have turned and never looked back. But instead, I stood frozen in place as one of the boys, the smallest one, bent down and picked up the ball. He held it out to me, his hand trembling slightly. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We just want to play." My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, my body trembling. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "I can't. I won't." The children didn't move. They just watched, their expressions never changing. And then, as if on cue, they all turned at once and began to fade, their bodies dissolving into the night like mist. I ran home that night faster than I ever had before, and from that moment on, I avoided the playground entirely. But even now, as I lie in bed, I can still hear their voices, soft, distant, but unmistakable. They're waiting, and I know one day they'll ask me to play again.